Welcome, everyone, to the second in Building Civic Strength, a series of community conversations and a partnership of New Hampshire Civics and New Hampshire Public Radio. Tonight, we're gathered with an audience at Franklin Pierce University in Rindge, New Hampshire, and we have a great virtual audience joining us as well. Welcome to everybody. Our series is based on a fundamental concern and a question, with many Americans feeling our country's civic fabric is fraying. How do we build civic strength? What kinds of knowledge, skills, or attitudes are needed? Now, a special focus of this series is on civics education. What does the next generation especially need to know and understand and appreciate in preparation to lead our communities and our country? Tonight at Franklin Pierce University, we have 4 guests to help us explore these questions. I'm very pleased to introduce them. They are Dottie Morris, Associate Vice President for Institutional Equity and Diversity at Keene State College. Dottie, it is great to see you again. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also with us, John Greabe, Director of the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service at the UNH School of Law, where he is also a professor of constitutional law. And John Greabe, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Hannah McCarthy. She's co-host of New Hampshire Public Radio's award-winning podcast, Civics 101. Hannah, I really appreciate you taking time out. Thank you.
I appreciate you, Laura. This is great.
Last but not least with us is Alexis Messina. Most of you in this audience probably know her. She's a junior here at Franklin Pierce University who is studying political science. I think her parents and her political science professors are both in the audience tonight. Alexis, it's great to have you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So throughout this 5-part series, we are exploring this question: what is at the heart of civic strength? And we're going to start there. And Dottie, I'm going to begin with you, please. What does a civically strong country look like? What does it have that's helping create that civic strength?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you very much. One of the things, the first things I think about is how do you make sure that the most people can have access to having their voices heard? I think that that's key, that you would have a situation where you could have several people coming together to co-create the agenda for that particular country. And so that means that you have to make sure that you have several processes in place that would mimic that would allow for people to have those conversations. The second thing I think about is the idea that your values have to be throughout everything that you do. So the way that you do things. So if you say you have a value of freedom and justice for all, that when you're engaging in the process of allowing people to speak and to be open, that process, that value is key and foundational to everything that you do. The third thing I think about is, I always think about Dr. King's beloved community, because in my mind, that's the way a civic, an environment like this would look. It would be where there would be opportunities for people to speak. There wouldn't be any silencing of voices. There would be an understanding that we care about each other in a way that we really want each other to be successful and to go as a country. And the last thing is the idea that there would be elders who have worked through their issues and can center the future generations in such a way that any decisions that are made will be made with the future. 7 generations, as the American Indians talk about, 7 generations from now, that all of those decisions that we would make today, we would think about the potential impact on 7 generations from now. So that's the way, when I think about a civically engaged and strong environment, I think about those things.
Wow, great. And you're teeing up something we're going to talk about a little bit later, the Constitution and some of the values it expresses and whether we do live up to those values. But John Greabe, to you next. What are some of the fundamentals that a civically strong country would have?
I think I'm thinking of 3 things in particular right now. First of all, I would say that a healthy civic society is a society which is going to have profound disagreements, even intractable disagreements. But it is going to be committed to solving those disagreements or working those disagreements out in some way under the rule of law. Okay, under the institutions that are set up by the constitution of that society, whatever that is, okay, with people who hold power in that society acting in good faith, and that all voices will be heard in the society. So I think those are the three things, okay, that a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to resolving disputes within the political culture, okay. Secondly, those holding power under the system, being committed to the rule of law, you know, and acting in good faith. And then third, inclusion of all voices.
Wow. And Alexis, I'm going to turn to you next, actually. But instead of asking you what a civically strong nation looks like, what about a community? We're very proud of our community engagement here in New Hampshire, even a campus community like here at Franklin Pierce University. What makes a civically strong community, Alexis?
My big thing is education, educating yourself. We're so lucky here that we have the resources, everyone on this campus, to have an education. But when I talk about education, I mean literally educating yourself, like doing research instead of relying on other marginalized groups to do the research for you. And knowing about those things is how we make progress. We can't make progress without doing our research first. So I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about civics education a little bit later, both at the university level, but also at the state level. So Hannah, that is a perfect segue to you. Your podcast, Civics 101, is all about civics education. So just pick up on what Alexis said, please. What's the role of education in civic strength?
Yeah, I think like a few years ago, I would have said it's really important to self-educate and know what your rights are, because you only can really uphold them if you know what they are, right? They're not just automatically from on high given to you. You have to know what they are to defend them. I still believe that, you know, and that's what I try to teach people with Civics 101. I now also very firmly believe, because I've started to get into, in part because of Martha, a lot of people who do a lot of great research into what makes someone civically healthy, civically strong. And I think what does that in a society is that you have to start educating people young, as in not just a civics class in high school. You know, we put, and this is a stat that many educators will know, we put about $50 federal towards STEM education for every enrolled student in America. We put about 5 cents towards civics education for every enrolled student in America. Now, if education is about helping someone to be successful in something, you know, ostensibly to be successful in STEM, great. How are you going to be a successful citizen of a democracy if you haven't been educated in that democracy? And I don't just mean how government works and who you're voting for. I also mean how to communicate with one another, how to accept differences, how to know that there will be disagreements. Hallelujah, that is our democracy. Now that we've established that, let's agree on how to communicate and move forward. I mean, that's civic strength, and I think we're really lacking in that in America, because we're not spending the time and money to educate kids on how to fight without fighting. You know what I mean? How to debate as opposed to go at each other's necks.
Educating or setting a good example.
Oh, yeah,
as adults.
absolutely. Yeah.
Those dollar figures you gave really give a strong sense of where our priorities are. And Alexis, you know, you're a junior in college now, so not long ago you were a high school student in Manchester. So what was your own civics education like? How robust was it?
There's barely any. Manchester School District. I had a semester of a civics class that was required in my high school, and I couldn't tell you what I learned from it because it was so long ago. I don't remember. We don't keep having civics classes throughout high school, and it was about just the branches of government and what they are. It wasn't current events or anything like that, and that's obviously learning about how the government works is important, but the current events are what's happening to us now. Those are also important. And then my senior year of high school, I took an AP government class, and that dove into it a little more, but it wasn't required. It was something that I chose to take, and not every student is going to choose to take that.
Right. That's a very specific choice that you're right. Not a lot of students would make. And, you know, Dottie, you interact with students as well at Keene State College. So what do you find most lacking when it comes to their civic knowledge?
Right. I think a lot of the students had the same experience as you had in high school. Most students will say, I didn't take civics, or, you know, they're not clear about how the government and the different branches interact and relate to one another, or how you can, as a citizen, express your disagreement with the government. Very little about that. And students seem to be really hungry to learn that information. A few years ago, we had a teach-in, and one of the ones that was with the most students in it, I mean, the room was packed. And of course, it was pre-COVID because you can't pack rooms anymore. But anyway, the room was packed, students sitting on the floor because they wanted this information. They were asking questions. They were very engaged. And I think that this idea of how do you, this might sound a little strange, and if you disagree, I really want you to say it. But I think that this idea that if you don't know how to confront or interrogate, what's happening within your government, you can be silent, and it's very easy for things for you to not have that right to do it or be able to express yourself. And so the students were trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we navigate this? And we don't even really understand how to do it. So,
speaking of expressing yourself, for those of you here at Franklin Pierce University in our in-person audience, please write down your question or comment, hold your comment card up, and Michael Brindley will come around and collect it very soon. And we'll start bringing you to the microphone in about another 10 minutes or so. Also, if you're participating online, that's great. Put your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we really look forward to your participation. I know we have a lot of students here from Franklin Pierce University tonight, and that's great. So please do get your questions in. And Hannah, not to pick on young people, because adults' civic knowledge, isn't that grand either. So what questions or misunderstandings do you, as host of Civics 101, just run into again and again and again?
I see a lot of cynicism that presumes this sort of seat of evil on Capitol Hill. And that's a really kind of mushy thing that I'm working through with my co-host, how to confront that, because not so sexily, when we dig into it, it's more complicated and more boring than that. And it's really more the system that you're running up against as opposed to the evil Gorgon. The other big thing is, these are arguments I get into with friends of mine. Listeners will write in and say, my vote is worthless. Gerrymandering has completely ruined my voice in this country. There's no reason really for me to go out and vote, and I've been suppressed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my argument for that is, in some ways, you're right. In other ways, the simple presumption that you've been suppressed is letting the person who's trying to suppress you but can't really do it because of the Voting Rights Act win, right? So I also say, don't just show up. I mean, you might be in a gerrymandered district that frustrates you. Don't just show up because you're supposed to. Show up because you contribute to a demographic. I am a white woman under the age of 40. I have a degree and I have a job where I make X amount of money, right? If a bunch of people in my demographic also show up, regardless of whether or not my particular vote packs a big punch in the next election, politicians are going to be looking at people like me who probably have similar beliefs about things, right? And then my issues will be focused on it. And I say that goes for, I mean, that's the chiefest reason, I think, to show up and vote. Make yourself someone who cannot be ignored, even as people are trying to ignore you.
That's really interesting. So people who sort of crunch the data and do the analytics are looking at who's showing out in big numbers. I guess we better pay attention to them.
And then watch the advertisements the next time around and see
Yes,
if they're paying
indeed.
attention.
What do you think, Alexis? I'm so struck by what Hannah says. Do you think young people feel like they've heard so much chatter about your vote doesn't count that they feel their vote doesn't count?
Yeah, and
Really?
when you were talking, it made me think that there's also, I think there's a lot of privilege in not thinking you have to vote, because there are certain people that need changes made to help their demographic. And as you were saying, without those people, not just those people voting, but the people that need to help them make votes in their favor, there's not anything that's going to change.
Well, I want to turn it over to our audience here at Franklin Pierce University, and then we are going to talk about the Constitution. I'm going to kick that off with you, John Greabe. Is the Constitution a source of civic strength or civic weakness, or a little bit of both? But let's go first to our audience here at Franklin Pierce University. And if you're listening online, we also invite you to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Michael, I think we have one person over here. So thanks for turning out. It's great to see all these students. Thank you.
vote. My name is Abigail Farley. And so my question for all of you is, how do you feel about the legislation being passed in New Hampshire that's restricting discussions about race? Do you think this will affect civic discussion later in the future that children are being uneducated about this, or being taught both sides, and actually not votes about things like the Holocaust?
I'm glad you turned out, because this is something that I wanted to ask the panel about when we talk about civics education. And actually, Dottie, I'll go to you first. A big focus of the series is on education, and I want to ask you about that New Hampshire law that our guest raised. This is the divisive concepts law, for those who are not familiar with it, whose supporters say too much discussion of what they call divisive concepts creates division. How do you see these laws affecting civic strength, Dottie?
Well, because that's a slippery slope. If we start to ban certain concepts, where will it end? And I think that part of what it won't allow us to do is to hear those multiple perspectives and voices if we start going down this pathway of banning concepts, of banning things that we could talk about, of getting that much into the weeds of what can happen in a classroom with a group of students to, once again, model how can you have these conversations? Because, you know, I mean, because they're divisive concepts, I want to be able to create an environment, a container for people to learn how to have those conversations, where we could have them without attacking each other. Because what I do know is the more we avoid having a conversation, the more we avoid having the conversation, the more we avoid having the conversation, the more contentious it could get. So my strong desire is to create those environments. That's what we do a lot at my college, at Keene State. I know they're doing it here at Franklin Pierce. We're doing it everywhere because we want people to learn how to have those conversations. We want to be people to look at each other's eyes and make some of the statements that if we don't do it, then people will be holding it in. And we do know that what you think and what you feel will have an impact on your behavior. So I'm really nervous when it comes to banning those things. And it smacks in the face, in my opinion, of the Constitution, but I could be wrong. I said 7 civics in 7th grade many years ago for an entire year. And I still remember what Mr. Duhan taught me.
So the divisive concepts law actually creates civic weakness in your
my
opinion,
opinion,
Dottie.
yes.
Yeah, and Alexis, you're nodding. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, the divisive concepts, I know a big argument for it is to protect their kids, but is it protecting kids, or are we protecting United States legacy, like the narrative that we want to teach them? Because if we're not gonna teach about important things like the Holocaust, then how are we supposed to move past? How are we supposed to learn from our mistakes and not make them again? We can't just cover it up.
We have another member of our audience here at Franklin Pierce University to the microphone. Good evening. Go ahead. Thank you for being here. Give us your name and go ahead with your comment, please.
Thank you all for being here. I love Civics 101. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Hannah and Nick. So I tend to agree with John's comment about rule of law, institutions, leaders who lead in good faith. And my question is, what if all that goes wrong? The leaders don't lead in good faith. What role critical thinking? How do you encourage it? What should we be thinking about in that respect?
Andy, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing your class here tonight. It's really great. It's really great to see them. And John, so let's turn to it. First to address Andrew's question, and then the question of whether the Constitution itself is a source of civic strength or weakness. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a poignant question right now, isn't it? It's you know, there are lots of examples out there of people who hold power who strike many of us as not acting in good faith. And of course, we have the recent example of what happened on January 6th, and that was an effort to affect change, to make something happen, but not within our constitutional system. I still, I guess, come back to the idea that the first 3 words of the Constitution are "we the people." It's still a form of government where we are the ultimate arbiters, we the people. And if we the people of the United States continue to insist upon governance under our Constitution. Now, recognizing that there are very, very different visions of what our Constitution is and ought to be. But if efforts to act outside the Constitution are rejected by a majority, a supermajority of we the people, if good faith on the part of our elected officials and our other officials holding power is demanded by we the people, I think ultimately that's what will happen. It may be bumpy. There may be unpleasantness. There may be violence. But I do think that insisting upon self-governance it may seem frustrating at times, but think of the alternatives. Think of the alternatives. History tells us that the alternatives are far worse.
Well, and so the Constitution, a source of civic strength, John, or a source of civic weakness? And let me just preface it by saying at our first event in Franklin, we asked the guests and the audience, what's one word that comes to mind when you think of civic strength? And people had great responses. They said education, humility, leadership, but no one said the Constitution is a source of civic strength. So what do you think, John?
Well, that doesn't surprise me because
I was surprised.
Well, I'd like to start answering that by contrasting the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence, right? So we learn about both documents. And the Declaration of Independence is a statement of our ideals, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, of course, the hypocrisy was off the charts when we made that statement, but it was a statement of ideals. The Constitution was not a statement of ideals. It was a compromise. It was a compromise with evil, quite honestly, because we would not have been able to form a constitution without the buy-in of the states that continued to depend upon slavery. Our Constitution eventually broke apart in the sense that we fought a civil war, a horrific civil war for 4 years. And then we reconstituted ourselves after the Civil War. And so when I think of the strength of the Constitution, I think, first of all, those first three words, that it emanates up from the people, that it's still in our hands. And I think of those Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, then eventually the 19th Amendment, which extended the franchise to women, where it took those amendments to the Constitution to bring everybody in, to say everybody has a seat at the table and everybody has a voice. And actually, it didn't happen just when those amendments passed either. It really didn't happen until the Voting Rights Act, which was mentioned before, 1965. So I think the Constitution is a potential source of civic strength. It's all in there. It's really all in there. But it also depends on those holding power operationalizing it in a way that reinforces our fundamental values. One aspect of the Constitution that I will point out as perhaps undermining civic strength.
So a source of civic weakness.
A source of civic weakness is that, as currently interpreted, it is very hard to experiment with change, even though so many of us believe that change is necessary. The Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution as not permitting anything really to be done in a court of law about partisan gerrymandering. I think all of us are watching the effects of partisan gerrymandering, and it's impossible to really find anyone who makes a substantive defense of it. We are not permitted to experiment with things like term limits, again, because of an interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. And I think most perniciously, the First Amendment has been interpreted as preventing experimentation with regulating money and the effects of money and the corrosive effects of money within our political order. Now, those are not inevitable interpretations of the Constitution. All of those decisions by the Supreme Court contain very powerful dissents. But right now, those are the law, and it makes it hard to change.
Well, so Dottie, I want to turn to you too. Let's stick with this Constitution theme for a little bit longer. What do you think? But fundamentally, how much is our Constitution, Dottie, a source of civic strength or a source of civic weakness, as John is alluding to?
Well, as I was thinking about context, for example, so when I think about when the Constitution was developed, as John pointed out, it was, not inclusive of a lot of people. So now, as we interrogate that document that was written at a particular time, it sounds like it's hard for us to do that. And I think that part of our duties as citizens would be to interrogate something like that, to say, well, given the context, the current context, can we still interpret these things in this way? Or should there be a change? And I don't know if that is something that's possible, but it's definitely something that I think about often when I like when I was in 7th grade, I even realized, oh, this doesn't quite fit from the way that I understand, because I grew up in Louisiana. And so I had many examples of how things were not, we hold these truths and all of that. It's just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. So I think that we do have to figure out, how do we interrogate it as citizens? And how do we push for change for it to be more current in our current lives? So.
Yeah, I'm glad
Yeah.
you said that, because I wanted to ask you that, Alexis, too. I mean, just your thoughts as a young person, college student, on sort of changing times and how we view this document. How do you and your classmates view it?
A lot of us don't, I think. For me, I've only analyzed it before because I am a political science student. And I think that goes back to with difference between STEM and civic students and stuff like that. If you're not going to choose that path, you're not necessarily going to look into it. And I feel like in my generation, a lot of us care more about morals and what we see as right and wrong and how we view people as human beings, as opposed to the words that are written on a piece of paper. And not necessarily if it's a bad or good thing, but I know my generation doesn't necessarily analyze that document much.
That's interesting. So you're not
Yeah.
looking at it, you're looking at it with some skepticism.
Yeah, there definitely is some skepticism because again, it's when it was written, there is that hypocrisy of it. And I think that's a big thing that a lot of us think of as well.
Do you want to jump in real quick, there,
Just
John?
a really quick, to just sort of supplement what you're saying. I mean, nearly all of the Constitution, and indeed all of the Constitution that really matters, was written prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was not really until the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that access to the franchise was broadly enjoyed by people of color. And so it does raise this question, if my forebears were not part of the political system that created this document, why do I owe allegiance to this? Why should I care that this document says that we can't try this in the 21st century because, when this provision was enacted, it was understood that that would not be allowed. Because it was understood that it would not be allowed in a society where women and people of color and Native Americans were being treated horrifically. So that's a very, very powerful
Why are we always
objection, I think.
going back and saying, well, what would the founders say? And you're saying, to heck with what the founders would say.
Well, I think a lot of people would say, why should I care?
Yeah.
My main question will not be what would they say, but what would they do? Because I think that the words are incongruent with the actions. And you have to have that congruency in my mind. If not, the words mean nothing.
Well, and so the founders, we're not going to give them too much of our time, but Hannah, I did want to ask you, how much did these founders see this document, the Constitution, as a source of, yes, civic strength for this new nation they were trying to build?
I think it was more of this nation's falling apart. We screwed up big time. We need something new really fast and we have to do it in secret. The Articles of Confederation were written. They didn't really have great tax policy. The nation's in a great deal of debt. It's trying to make a name for itself on the global stage. And Shays' Rebellion happens in Washington. George Washington is thinking, okay, so rebellions are starting, so this isn't good. I think he can't remember exactly what George Washington says, but it's something along the lines of, those guys in Britain are going to be laughing at us. We fought them for this freedom and we're dissolving before their very eyes. And I think it was Adams who said, yeah, people in Britain, are making fun of you, and they're making these jokes that are like, just wait till they come walking back in through our door and we're going to toy with them and then send them on their merry way, like the ultimate breakup revenge story. Like, really, it's the dream, right? But what these framers were doing was preserving the Union. You know, we the people, I believe initially it was we the delegates of New Jersey, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, like, and then someone thought, ooh, PR wise, that's not great. We don't want to indict ourselves in a total rewriting of American governance. It's the people who are agreeing to this wonderful new document with these high principles of the Enlightenment and all of that. And so I'm cynical about all of that. And I think the great thing is that Americans, that especially disenfranchised, dispossessed Americans, looked at those words, we the people, and said, oh, whoops, you included us. I guess you have to give us our rights and responsibilities as well. And I think that's what we've seen throughout history, is that the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the downtrodden have come back and said, no, you said we the people. And so we will enforce that, you know, or the creek don't rise. I mean, it's sort of like it doesn't matter, right? Because we now decide what it means to us and how we're going to fight for that. You talk about like pain and violence. The civil rights era was in many ways typified by that. And it involved a lot of people putting their words and their bodies on the line to reinforce basic principles of the Constitution that we read into it. And I think that's where I draw the civic strength from the Constitution.
That's really, I love that analysis. The Constitution is largely a PR document to show Europe that we weren't falling apart, but oops, they put we the people in.
Yeah, we sent it over there right away and said, we have a government, don't worry, we're good. You don't have to, you know, take us over again.
I'm Laura Knoy, and you're listening to Building Civic Strength, a partnership of New Hampshire Civics and NHPR. I'm speaking with Dottie Morris, Head of Equity and Diversity at Keene State College, John Greabe, Director of the Rudman Center at UNH Law and a Professor of Constitutional Law, Hannah McCarthy, co-host of NHPR's award-winning podcast, Civics 101, and Alexis Messina, a political science major at Franklin Pierce University. We'll be right back with more of this conversation, along with questions from our audience, all recorded live earlier this month at Franklin Pierce University, so don't go away. I'm Laura Knoy, and you're listening to NHPR. Welcome back to Building Civic Strength, a series of community conversations we're having throughout this spring across the Granite State. We've been asking our guests, what is at the heart of civic strength? We've also been hearing from in-person and online audiences. So for those of you here at Franklin Pierce University in person, again, please hold your question card up and Michael Brindley will come around to you as soon as he's ready. Also, if you're participating online, put your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We have another question from our audience here at Franklin Pierce University. Good evening, give us your name, please, and go ahead with your question or comment.
Kath Allen. I had civics in high school, and it was fantastic. And I also had parents, both sides of the political spectrum, so got it left and right. Then ran into finding out civics wasn't going through all the schools over the years. I took intro to law and was actually here at Franklin Pierce doing some law research because precedents. My daughter took the same course 30 years later at a different university, and all they did was read books and do tests. No research, no discussions. How do we get through the parents who haven't been having civics ed and get civics back into the schools as well as into the colleges?
Wow, great question. And a big focus of this series, again, civics education. I'm not sure, Dottie, can I throw that one to you first, maybe? And we can just play with it for a little bit.
Okay, let's play. Well, you know, at Keene State, I could use that as an example. We have something called the American Democracy Project. And part of that is to teach students to how they could be active participants and active citizens. So we are trying to find ways to do it like that. And like I said, we had the teach-in where we did the Civics 101 course, and that led to students from the College Republicans and the College Democrats to have some really good dialogue with one another as a result of learning some of those things and really wanting to create a different type of reality around how those two political parties and people within them have conversations, because both groups said that they were tired of the way that the narrative was playing out between the two
They
groups.
said that.
Yes, they really did. I was very proud because it really spoke to how much these young people cared about the future and cared about the current process that we had in place. They wanted to shift it. So I think that if enough young people, again, use their leverage, especially at colleges and universities, you can definitely create some change. And I know at Keene State, we even encourage students to use their voices in ways that get the message back to us. Because to silence the voice of young people creates a different kind of engagement that you would prefer not to have. So the listening, the opening it up, saying, okay, how might we even assist you in this process of getting what you need met? So I think that that's important, is having young voices, and the voices, we're hearing them tonight, you know?
Well, and I'm really glad that this issue came up. So thank you for the question, because Alexis, I did want to ask you, in addition to learning the nuts and bolts of civics, you know, the branches of government and how a bill becomes law and so forth, how much have your social studies and political science classes demonstrated what Dottie just talked about, the civil discourse aspects of civics?
Here at Franklin Pierce has been really helpful because, not to out me and my classmates, but if you just give us books, we're not going to read them. We're not going to just read textbooks. Like, we have to have conversations like this. We have to have projects that we're doing hands-on learning. I've done, in high school, I did a mock trial. Here we did like a mock moot court. And I feel like that hands-on learning is a lot more helpful to us. I know I can't speak for every student, but that's so much more helpful for us to walk through that and be able to ask questions than just be assigned reading. And we need to be able to have those conversations and have our voices be heard in the classroom and learn how to debate with each other as human beings.
Hannah, I wonder, we do see so much incivility in civic spaces these days. Do you get a sense, you know, doing the work that you do, that it's turning some people off from civic participation? They don't want to go to the town meeting. They'll get shouted down. They don't want to attend a community discussion. They might, you know, get blasted on social media or something. What do you think?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because it's not as though I'm encountering people who are disinterested in having that conversation in a space wherein it's actually a conversation. In actual fact, I'm often encountering people who desperately want to have these conversations, but there is a deep fear that the divisiveness that has spread across our nation will mean that, yes, they might state something that someone disagrees with, but they will disagree so vehemently and so personally that you've lost the meaning and the content and the purpose of the conversation to begin with. And I think this speaks to, I do a weekly Twitter chat. It's called SS Chat for any social studies educators out there. It's excellent. It's just social studies educators across the country talking about how they educate. Yesterday, it was talking about how to teach people how to be thoughtful, inclusive voters. And so many of them were saying, like, even though this isn't really in the curriculum, what I do is I just ask students, you know, what are you interested in? What are the issues at top of mind? And then I just sit back and let them talk about it. And these are individuals being asked to give a name to what they care about, and they're being asked to do that in a lightly moderated environment. And I think that's what we need to prepare people to then be adults who can go into a town meeting and feel like, well, I know that I'm around people who basically want the same harmonious community that I do, right? We're all ultimately working to fix the same problems, right? We're living in the same community. So I think that if you get those principles in early enough, you are then creating a polity that's able to have conversations.
And before we go back to our live audience here at Franklin Pierce University and our online audience, John Greabe, I just want to fold you into this broadly. You're the head of the Rudman Center at UNH Law. You're a professor of constitutional law. What's the sort of conversation you hear among students about the level of incivility we see in our civic life, and whether it's encouraging students to get engaged? I mean, law students enjoy, you know, rule of law, politics, or is it creating a chilling effect. I wonder what you're seeing. What
Well,
you're hearing.
There is concern. I teach constitutional law, so which is a required first-year course, and in the course of that course, we talk about things that are deeply that our nation is deeply divided about. In the past few years, I definitely have seen an uptick in the sort of behavior that unfortunately gets modeled from on high. We talk constantly, though, about creating an environment that does not track what's going on outside of the building. We talk about the fact that lawyers, to be effective lawyers, need not to behave like that. They need to be able to have conversations with people who they deeply disagree with, and they need to be effective at those conversations. I think by keeping it about professionalism in that way, that has helped some. But there's no doubt it's a course that some people are really nervous about coming into because they, maybe their own personal journey led to some tough times that that we're talking about in the course, and to listen to people judge and pontificate unkindly and in personal terms can be really, really painful. It can be painful.
So as a professor, you're trying to create this environment where we can have a civic discourse about one of the most important documents in America. And that must be that sounds like work.
I think it is. I mean, it's hard to talk about abortion, right? That's a topic we have to talk about in constitutional law, the law of abortion and where it's been and where it's going. But it's such an emblem for other things, and it's really hard to sometimes keep it to that topic as a legal conversation.
Let's go back to our in-person audience, and thank you for coming out. Go ahead with your question, please, and give us your name too, please.
Thank you. I'm Liv, and I use social media like I'm sure everyone else here does. So I wanted to know, how have you seen social media impact civic engagement and education?
Yeah, really following what we've been talking about. And boy, Alexis, I know you and I talked about that on the phone, how social media may be affecting sort of civic life.
Yeah, we live in a world where now pretty much everything that happens, there's a live stream of it, there's a video recording of it. So we see what's happening either as it's happening or minutes after. And I think social media has positive and negative effects, because it's great that everyone is able to be informed and see these videos and see these things that are actually happening so they can see. But on the other hand, things travel so fast, and since they're traveling so fast, we're not getting the whole story. And I know a big thing with Twitter is people read a headline of something and then they don't read the full article. And that's something that I've done before. I've tried to be better with that too, is because since things travel so fast, people read a headline and they don't bother to look into what the actual story is.
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear from you too, Dottie, on how you see social media affecting our civic health and our civic strength in the country. I think Alexis makes some really good points.
Very good point. The whole idea of cancel culture too, I think adds to that, where people are concerned that if they post something today, 3 years later, it'll come back and haunt them. So, and in this country, again, please disagree with me. I don't think that we believe that people can redeem themselves after you make some, I'm just so happy we didn't have social media when I was in college, because I would have been so canceled so many times that I wouldn't even be here today, because I did some things that were just not the brightest things in the world. And so maybe that's why I work with college students, because, maybe I'm still there. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But I do think that it has an impact on, because I was trained as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and I do think that there's something about having a real conversation with a real life person rather than some anonymous person out there in Facebook. People don't still use Facebook, but I still use Facebook in Facebook land. And so you start to wonder, what effect does it have? Because it's easier to say unkind things when the person isn't sitting in the room with you. It's much easier for me to say those things about people when I'm not sitting there with them, where I'm not engaged, where I'm not present. And I could see that how my words are falling on me. And I think that because of that, some people are throwing darts at one another, where if we could pull them in the room, and we do have those situations at Keene State where people will throw things out, but when we bring people into a room, it's a different kind of encounter. And so I think that could really help if we had more opportunities to have those face-to-face conversations.
Well, it's great to have a face-to-face audience here at Franklin Pierce University, and thank you for that question. You're listening to Building Civic Strength, a partnership between New Hampshire Civics and NHPR. We'll be right back with more of this community conversation after a quick break. I'm Laura Knoy, and you're listening to NHPR. Welcome back to Building Civic Strength, a series of community conversations and a partnership of New Hampshire Civics and NHPR. In the second of our series earlier this month, we went to Franklin Pierce University in Rindge. Our panel included Dottie Morris, the head of equity and diversity at Keene State College, John Greabe, director of the Rudman Center at UNH Law and a professor of constitutional law, Hannah McCarthy, co-host of New Hampshire Public Radio's award-winning podcast, Civics 101, and Alexis Messina, a political science major at Franklin Pierce University. Throughout this whole series, we've been asking our guests, what is at the heart of civic strength? We've also heard from audiences, both in person and online. Let's now return to our conversation at Franklin Pierce University. Here's a question from one of our online audience members. This is from Al, who says, we are flooded with stories of Washington, yet local municipal government and school boards have significant impact on communities. How do we inform residents about how they can operate and engage in these offices and communities? Al, this is an awesome question. Hannah, I'm going to throw it to you.
Yes, this is for the longest time. Nick and I have wanted to do an episode about state and local government. And here's the problem: when you're a national civics podcast, you have to make 50 of them if you're going to do that, because it's different everywhere. So my number one piece of advice is call your county clerk's office. Believe it or not, there are people there who are not there to be barriers, or there to tell you exactly how it works, who frankly, when you call, are like, oh, you want to run, or you want to know about how voting works? Come on in, we'll show you a voting machine if you're in a state that uses voting machines. We will, explain to you how your vote is counted if that's what you're worried about, or we will try to address the issues that you have. State and local government in particular, is accessible. It's right there, it's down the street, and it's affecting you in more hard ways than the federal government is. It has more control over you. And it's slightly easier to get involved. You start at a lower level. New Hampshire in particular, I've never been in a state in which I've seen so many people, as Jim Schachter said, involved in state and local government and capable of becoming involved in state and local government. That is how you will feel empowered. You might be able to shed a little bit of your disillusionment and fear once you see how things work on the inside, and you will be able to effect actual change because you are on the inside. So I really can't say enough for paying as much attention as possible to the far less flashy, sort of like flickering light bulb in a building built in the 50s in the basement. Like that's where your government is. And I say go to it, learn as much as you can about it, because it is the most accessible form that you have.
Well, it's interesting, and too, we talked about sort of the negative political culture, whether that's discouraging people from getting engaged. I have a friend who recently ran for select board in his town, and I said, you did what? I thought it's scary out there. And he said, no, it's actually going really well. So I think there's this over impression that we have, as our questioner, Al, says, we hear about Washington, but maybe there is some hope for civic engagement at the local level. Let's go back to our audience here at Franklin Pierce University. Good evening, sir. Thank you for coming out. Give us your name, please, and go ahead.
Sure. I'm Pierre Morton, and this is sort of back to the Constitution. In 1851, Frederick Douglass changed his stance on the Constitution, referring to it as an anti-slavery document, in essence, a freedom document. That new evolved stance by Frederick Douglass was the end of sort of his label as an agitator or an activist. And he started his career as a man who really embraced the Constitution by using its language as an instrument for change. So what is the role or contribution of activists or agitators to civic discourse?
Great question. And I think a lot of people want to jump in on that, but John, since he said Constitution, I'm going to turn to you first.
Well, what
Thank you.
immediately put me into mind of is, Frederick Douglass is such a great example of this, because early in his career, he was aligned with those who denounced the Constitution as an evil, had wanted nothing to do with it. And then over time came to see within its text, and this was the pre-Reconstruction Constitution that he even saw hope in, and once the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, then all bets were off. This is very much at the heart of the debate